All right, so yesterday we talked about finding the domain of a graph. Domain is the set of all x values. So the strategy we used was to trace every single point on the graph back to the x-axis to see which x values it was using. Today we are going to talk about finding the range of a graph. And what we need to remember is that range means the set of all y values or outputs for a function. So today we are going to be in a y value mindset. Y values are what we're going to be looking for. Again, to kind of focus our attention, when we look at a graph on a coordinate plane, we discussed already that this x-axis is where we're going to find our domain. So that's what we focused on yesterday. This y-axis is where we're going to find our range. So today we are going to be focusing our attention on this y-axis. Now, for the examples today, I'm going to use the same graphs that I used yesterday to demonstrate domain. And we're going to use a similar type of strategy. What we're going to do is we're still going to be tracing these points back to where they came from. But this time around, we are going to be tracing all of our points back to this y-axis. So to get us started here, if I started at this point on my circle, and I traced it back to the y-axis, I would land here, which is 0. And notice that there's another point over here that also traces back to that 0. So I know 0 on the y-axis is in the range, because both of these points trace back to him. Okay, if I moved up here, and I trace that point back to the y-axis, he goes back to a y value of 1. And notice there's another point over here on this other side that does the same. So 1 is in the range. 2 is in the range, because both of those points trace back to him. And then we reach this spot up here where we know 3 is in the range because it's on the y-axis. And then when I go above that, the circle's not there anymore. So nobody will trace back to 4 or 5 or 6. Negative 1 is in my range because he will trace back to 2 of the points that are on the graph. Negative 2 traces back to 2 points that are on the graph. And then I reach negative 3, he is on the graph. And once I go below that, no more circles. So nobody traces back to negative 4, or to negative 5, or to negative 6. So all of these numbers that I've marked here on the y-axis, from negative 3 up to positive 3, are in the range. And what I want you to notice is all of these numbers in between these dots would also be there. See, all of these points on the circle would trace back to something on that y-axis, even when those numbers are fractions or decimals. So my range starts out down here and goes up to here and includes all of these numbers in the middle. So notice it's that same strategy, it's just that we're going to the y-axis now instead of to the x. So you've got negative 3 and positive 3 as the beginning and end of the range. Put the smaller one first. So negative 3, positive 3. And notice that negative 3 and positive 3 are included. There aren't open circles there. So both of these would get brackets. So our range goes from negative 3 to positive 3. So we're doing sort of the same thing, but we're tracing back to the y-axis instead of to the x. All right, so y-axis. We're going to take the points that are on this graph and trace them back to the y-axis. Notice this is an open circle, which would trace back to here. So I'm going to put an open circle right there. And then as I move on down, these points would all trace over to that y-axis. Till I get down to here. And then this little section over here. So what I want you to notice, by the time I trace all of these points back to the y-axis, this is the lowest spot that I reached on the y-axis, and this is the highest. So the entire graph fits within this section. So right here is my range. Let me use a different color. Open here, close down here, and then all of this would be my range. So let's see what these numbers are. Here's 0. So that would be negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that would be negative 5. And then here's 0. That would be 1, 2, 3, 4. So on that y-axis, I can trace back to everything from a negative 5 all the way up to a positive 4. The negative 5 would get a bracket because y can actually be negative 5. And the 4 would get parentheses because of that open circle. So the range would go from negative 5 to 4. So it's all about shifting your focus. It's all about which axis are you tracing this graph back to. Okay, so here is the line that we talked about last time. And remember what we said. This line, because it has those arrows, is going to continue forever. Well, I think I keep clicking on the wrong thing. All right, I want to mark my y-axis. Starting with this point, he's actually on the y-axis. So the number negative 1 is in your range. And then if I start moving this way, and taking my line and going to each point on that line and tracing it back over to the y-axis, notice I've reached kind of the end of my line here, but not really the end, because you know this is going to keep going. So I'm going to be able to continue tracing that line down. For how long? Well, forever, because this is going to go forever. So negative infinity is where I'm headed with my range in that downward direction. And then I come up here to this other part of the line and start tracing each point over to the y-axis. My lines are getting more and more crooked. All right, now I've hit my arrow right here. But remember, that's not an end. That line's going to keep going up, so I'm going to continue to be able tracing that line back over to the y-axis for how long? Well, forever, because it's going to keep going up forever. So my range is going to go from negative infinity to positive infinity. Goes down forever, it goes up forever. And it would be parentheses. So same strategy, it's just that we're tracing back to the y-axis now instead of to our x. Okay. Let's start over here. If I take this point and trace him back to the y-axis, I land right there at 1. As I head on up, above and below that point, that whole section of my y-axis is being used. Now I need to go up here, and that's going to require me to go from this side. Now when I hit that arrow, don't forget that that's going to continue on. So you're going to continue going up because that graph is going to continue going up. That's going to let you go on forever in that upward direction. And then again, go down here to this section. Trace back over to that y-axis. Even though it looks like you've run out of room to do that, this is going to continue going down because of the arrow on the graph. So you're going to continue down forever because that graph is going to continue down forever. So your range would be from negative infinity to infinity. Parentheses for both. Every point on that graph you have to visualize, imagine, tracing every single point on that graph back to the y-axis. Keep doing the wrong thing. Okay. Up here at this tip-top point of the V, he goes back to the y-axis right there. And then all of these points trace back to the y-axis. You can trace all of these back. So we've got to look at it from both sides of that V. Now how long am I going to be able to continue that? Well, this arrow says, hey, that's going to keep headed down. So you're going to continue to be able to draw back over to the y-axis for each of these, and same thing on this side. That's going to keep going down. So on that side of the V, each point is going to trace back to that y-axis. So that would be infinite, and it would be negative infinity because we're headed down. And then 1, 2 would be our highest number. So it looks like on the y-axis, we're able to trace to a negative infinity on the bottom and to a positive 2 on the top. Parentheses always for infinity. At 2 there was no open circle, so that should be a bracket. 2 is included. Now hopefully what you're seeing as we do this, as we trace back to the y-axis, is that your range is really telling you how low the graph is going to go, what's the lowest it's going to reach, and then the highest. So hopefully you can kind of see that that's what's going on here. All right, for this guy, remember that vertical line. We're going to trace him back to the y-axis. I'm going to start right there, kind of in the middle. And then I'm going to move up the line, tracing each point back to the y-axis. So I keep going up, up, up. How long am I going to be able to keep doing that? Well, that tells me that's going to keep going up. So I'm going to be able to do that forever. And then on this bottom side of my line, tracing each point back to the y-axis. Keep going down, down, down. How long am I going to do that? Well, that arrow says forever. So my range on this function will go from negative infinity to infinity, parentheses on both. So you kind of have to train your eyes here to only look at the axis that matters. Okay, tracing each point on this graph back to the y-axis. So I'm going to start with this point, we'll go there. This point would go here. So I'm going to keep headed down, and you'll notice hitting a couple of points each time. And I want you to notice that I reach a point then when I'm at the arrow, but I know what that arrow means. The arrow means I'm not going to stop there. That means this thing is going to keep heading down forever. So even though I kind of reach the end of the line there, it's not really the end. I have to picture that keeps going. So how long will I keep going down? Well, because of the arrow, forever. So negative infinity is going to be a part of this range. Now I need to come over to this right side of the graph because I haven't dealt with it at all. Here's kind of the lowest point on that. So I'm going to start there and start tracing this side over to my y-axis. And notice I'm coming in contact with a lot of the same spots that I've already come in contact with. And I reach this point where I've got this arrow. Well, I know he's going to keep going up. So I'm going to be able to keep going up as well, matching those points up with the y-axis. And I'm going to be able to do that forever. So for the range on this one, I can keep tracing points in the downward direction forever and in the up direction forever. So this one would also have a range of negative infinity to infinity. All right, last one. This time I'm doing range, so I am tracing to the y-axis. So if I start with this point, and then work my way down, and I switch sides. Reach the end of the ray, not really the end though, because we know that's going to keep going. So for how long would I be able to keep tracing back in this downward direction? Because of the arrow, forever. So negative infinity on this end. Now up here, there was a dot, so I don't get to go up here for the range. This is as high as I can go. So 1. So for the range on this one, we're doing negative infinity to 1. Parentheses for negative infinity. And then we've got that closed dot on the 1, so bracket. So for today, when you're doing the range, take the points that are on the graph, and you have to consider every piece of that graph. Trace them back to that y-axis, and see what parts of the y-axis you are using. And notice that always when you write the range, you're going to be giving your lowest value and your highest value that you were able to reach. Those always show up over here in this range. If you have questions, please let me know.